November 1943. High above the Central Pacific, just after dawn. The sky is clean and cold, the kind of morning Japanese pilots once welcomed. Visibility is perfect. The ocean below looks harmless flat, endless, predictable. These are ideal conditions for air combat, the kind that rewards experience and precision. Inside the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, Lieutenant Commander Masao Yamaguchi scans the horizon. He is calm. Yamaguchi is not a novice. He has flown combat since the early victories of the war. He knows the rhythm of air combat intimately, the angles, the energy, the moment an American fighter begins to bleed, speed, and fall away. For 2 years, those moments have decided life and death. Ahead, his wingman calls out contacts. American fighters. Yamaguchi squints, dark blue shapes climbing into the sun, heavy, broad-winged. Hellcats. He tightens his grip on the controls. By now, Japanese pilots have learned the name. They've learned the shape. But habit is powerful, and instinct is hard to silence. Yamaguchi has defeated Wildcats dozens of times. The tactics are burned into his muscle memory. He signals the attack. The Zeros roll in smoothly, noses dropping, airspeed building. They close quickly, just as planned. One Hellcat drifts slightly wide an opening. Yamaguchi lines up the shot with professional ease and squeezes the trigger. Rounds strike home, metal flashes, smoke trails briefly from the American fighter's fuselage. It should break away. It doesn't. Instead, the Hellcat dives harder, then begins to climb straight up into thinner air. Yamaguchi follows. This is the moment Japanese doctrine is built for. The Zero is light, responsive, designed to dominate vertical maneuvers. The American fighter should stall. It always does. Except this one doesn't. The climb stretches longer than expected. Yamaguchi feels it first in the control's softening response, a subtle loss of authority. He glances at the Hellcat above him. It is still climbing. The distance between them does not shrink. It grows. Yamaguchi breaks off instinctively, leveling out to preserve speed. His heart rate spikes, not from fear, but from calculation gone wrong. Over the radio, another voice cuts in. They are not stalling. Another. They climb too long. The engagement dissolves into chaos. Hellcats dive from above, not turning, not circling, but striking in fast, brutal passes. Zeros try to respond with tight maneuvers, but the Americans refuse to play the old game. They climb away. They regroup. They return with altitude and speed. Within minutes, 2 Zeros are gone. The Americans lose none. When the surviving Japanese pilots disengage, the silence in their cockpits is heavy. No one celebrates. No one speaks until they are well clear of the enemy. Back at base, the debrief is tense. Maps are spread out. Combat reports pile up. Pilots describe the same thing again and again. American fighters refusing to stall, refusing to turn, refusing to die. Damage that should have ended a fight simply didn't. And slowly, an uncomfortable truth takes shape. The old tactics no longer work. For Japanese naval aviation, this is a dangerous realization. Their entire air combat doctrine, developed over years, refined through China and the early Pacific victories, is built around one assumption. The Zero's maneuverability guarantees control of the fight. But the Hellcat has changed the equation. It doesn't need to outturn the Zero. It doesn't need elegance. It needs power, structure, and the discipline to exploit them. And worst of all, it allows American pilots to survive mistakes. That single fact undermines everything. In Japanese cockpits, hesitation begins to appear. Pilots fire longer bursts, chasing kills that no longer come easily. They stay in fights too long, trying to force outcomes that used to be guaranteed. Losses increase. And, for the first time, Japanese commanders face a terrifying possibility. Air superiority may no longer be restored by courage or experience alone. It may require change, radical change. Within weeks, Japanese tactical manuals begin to shift. Vertical engagements are reconsidered. Prolonged chases are discouraged. Pilots are warned not to follow damaged American aircraft too far. These are not minor adjustments. They are admissions. Admissions that the Hellcat has forced Japan's best pilots to relearn how to fight mid-war, under fire, with diminishing resources. And this is only the beginning? By December 1943, Japanese pilots across the Central and Southwest Pacific are adjusting, not because headquarters has told them to, but because survival demands it. In briefings held beneath canvas awnings and inside half-darkened huts, squadron leaders begin saying things that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Do not pursue vertically. Do not follow damaged Americans. Disengage sooner. These are not refinements. They are reversals. The Zero had been designed for initiative for seizing control of a fight and pressing it until the enemy collapsed. Now pilots are being told to limit aggression, to conserve energy, to break contact early. For men trained to dominate the sky, this feels dangerously close to retreat. But the evidence is overwhelming. Zeros that chase Hellcats upward die. Zeros that linger after firing passes die. Zeros that assume a smoking American aircraft is finished die. Japanese pilots begin flying differently almost overnight. Instead of climbing after Hellcats, they try high-speed slashing attacks. One pass, short burst. break away immediately. They attempt coordinated dives, hoping to overwhelm with numbers rather than maneuver. It rarely works. The Hellcat is built for this kind of fight. It absorbs the initial attack, dives away with speed the Zero cannot safely match, then climbs back above the engagement. The Americans dictate distance and timing now, and Japanese pilots can feel it slipping out of their hands. Radio traffic reflects the change in tone. Where once voices were confident and clipped, now there is tension. Calls for assistance come earlier. Warnings are sharper. Pilots are more aware of what they cannot do. One Japanese pilot later recalls the sensation bluntly. It was like fighting with one arm tied. Behind the scenes, commanders scramble. New tactical memos are drafted. Training films are revised. Pilots are warned explicitly. Do not assume superiority. The Hellcat is treated not as another American fighter, but as a different category of opponent, one that must be avoided as much as engaged. This, more than anything else, marks the turning point. When pilots are taught how to avoid the enemy rather than defeat him, air superiority has already begun to change hands. The problem is timing. These adaptations arrive just as Japan's pilot pipeline is collapsing. Fuel shortages reduce training hours. Veteran instructors are pulled back into combat to stem losses. New pilots reach frontline units with barely enough experience to fly formation, let alone master revised tactics under fire. And revised tactics require discipline. They require patience. They require restraint, all of which are impossible to develop quickly, especially when facing an enemy that can survive mistakes. American pilots, meanwhile, are evolving in the opposite direction. Hellcat squadrons are encouraged to press advantages aggressively, knowing their aircraft will forgive errors. Pilots climb higher before engagements. They dive harder. They stay together. They exploit Japanese hesitation mercilessly. What Japanese pilots experience now is not just technical inferiority. It is psychological displacement. They are reacting instead of initiating, adjusting instead of controlling, flying carefully where they once flew boldly. And in air combat, caution rarely wins. By early 1944, the change is visible in the numbers. Japanese loss rates climb sharply even in engagements where tactics are followed correctly. The margin for error has vanished. Any deviation, any delayed breakaway, any misjudged climb ends in destruction. The Hellcat has not just forced tactical change. It has compressed time. Japanese pilots are being asked to unlearn years of instinct and relearn survival in weeks while already losing the war in the air. And with every engagement, one conclusion becomes clearer. No matter how tactics change, the Hellcat still holds the advantage, because it is not just faster or stronger. It allows its pilots to survive learning in combat. Japan no longer has that luxury. They are no longer fighting men. They are fighting machines. By early 1944, Japanese air units begin framing the Hellcat as something fundamentally different from previous American fighters. In debriefs and reports, pilots stop focusing on enemy skill and start describing enemy behavior. How the aircraft moves, how it absorbs damage, how it dictates the engagement regardless of the pilot inside. This shift matters. For years, Japanese air doctrine emphasized the superiority of the individual aviator. Training was long, selective, and elite. Victory came from intuition, aggression, and mastery of maneuver. The aircraft was a tool, important, but secondary. The Hellcat inverts that logic. Japanese pilots encounter American flyers who make mistakes, sloppy turns, late brakes, poor angles that should be fatal. But the Hellcat forgives them. Armor absorbs hits, fuel tanks seal, engines keep running. The pilot survives long enough to learn. And then he comes back. This is devastating. Japanese pilots realize they are not just facing a tougher aircraft, they are facing an enemy that improves faster with each encounter. Every American pilot who survives damage becomes more dangerous next time. Every Japanese pilot lost takes irreplaceable experience with him. The tactical response shifts again. Japanese units attempt to isolate Hellcats instead of engaging formations. They try surprise attacks from extreme angles, hoping to achieve catastrophic damage in the first second. They aim for the cockpit, the engine, anything that might overcome armor through precision. But precision requires time, and the Hellcat does not give time. Its speed and climb rate allow it to disengage instantly. Its structure allows it to ignore glancing hits. And its firepower means any mistake by a Zero, any moment spent lining up a perfect shot, can be fatal. The psychological burden grows. Pilots hesitate before committing. They second-guess climbs. They break away earlier than planned. In the air, these fractions of a second matter, more than courage or doctrine ever did. American pilots notice the change immediately. Japanese fighters no longer press attacks relentlessly. They disengage faster. They avoid vertical maneuvers entirely. They seem cautious, almost defensive. This caution is not cowardice. It is adaptation under impossible conditions. But adaptation cannot overcome arithmetic. Hellcats are arriving in squadrons. Replacement pilots are trained quickly but safely. Aircraft are repaired, not discarded. The system absorbs losses and keeps improving. Japan's system does not. By spring 1944, Japanese commanders understand the brutal truth. Tactical changes can slow defeat, but they cannot reverse it. The Hellcat has shifted air combat away from the realm where Japan once excelled. The fight is no longer about elegance or daring. It is about endurance. And endurance favors the side that can survive mistakes. For Japanese pilots, this realization is crushing, not because it insults their skill, but because it renders that skill insufficient. They are adapting as fast as humanly possible. But they are adapting to a war that has already moved past them. They are resigned to it. The shock has passed. The disbelief is gone. What remains is a grim understanding of limits, what can be done and what can no longer be attempted. Japanese squadrons entering combat now do so with strict instructions. Avoid prolonged engagements, avoid vertical climbs, avoid Hellcats in formation, strike only when surprise is absolute and disengage immediately. These tactics are followed carefully, and still losses continue. The reason is brutally simple. Adaptation cannot erase imbalance. Even when Japanese pilots execute textbook attacks, the Hellcat's advantages remain. It dives faster than the Zero can safely follow. It climbs away before a second pass can be set up. It absorbs damage that should have ended the fight. And when it returns, it does so with altitude, speed, and numbers. The Japanese response becomes increasingly defensive. Pilots conserve ammunition. They disengage early. They prioritize survival over victory, not by choice, but by necessity. The Zero, once an offensive weapon, is now flown as a fragile interceptor in a sky dominated by American patrols. This has consequences beyond tactics. Morale erodes. Pilots know before takeoff that the odds are against them. They know their aircraft cannot forgive mistakes. They know the enemy's aircraft can. Every mission becomes a calculation of risk rather than an opportunity for dominance. Meanwhile, American pilots fly with growing confidence. Hellcat squadrons operate aggressively, knowing that even imperfect execution rarely means death. They press advantages ruthlessly. They climb higher. They dive harder. They force engagements on their terms and disengage at will. What Japanese pilots feel most acutely is loss of control. They no longer decide when or how a fight happens. They respond. And in air combat, reaction is defeat delayed. The situation reaches its breaking point during large-scale carrier battles, where Japanese air groups face layered American defenses, radar-directed intercepts, disciplined formations, and waves of Hellcats rotating in and out of combat. Japanese pilots adapt tactically, but they cannot adapt structurally. They cannot change armor thickness. They cannot add firepower. They cannot replace lost veterans fast enough. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots are flying into combat already constrained by what they must not do. The Hellcat does not impose those limits, it exploits them. The result is catastrophic. Japanese tactics change overnight, but the balance of power does not. And as the air war reaches its climax, one truth becomes unavoidable. Adapting to the Hellcat is no longer about winning. It is about lasting as long as possible. June 1944. The ocean east of the Marianas is crowded with American carriers, more than Japanese pilots have ever faced at once. Radar screens glow deep inside U.S. ships, tracking incoming contacts long before engines are heard. Combat air patrols are already airborne, stacked by altitude, Hellcats circling patiently. Japanese air crews know this will be different. Briefings are blunt, fuel is limited, escort fighters are fewer. Many pilots flying this mission have never faced Hellcats in large numbers before. Veterans try to explain what to expect, what not to do. Do not climb after them. Do not chase. Do not turn for too long. The instructions feel restrictive, defensive, almost fatalistic. When Japanese strike groups finally appear on American radar, they are met not by surprise, but by preparation. Hellcats are vectored in from above and ahead, already positioned with altitude and speed. The first attacks are devastating. Hellcats dive through escorting Zeros with brutal efficiency. They do not linger. They fire, break away, climb, and return again. Japanese pilots attempt slashing attacks as taught, one pass, immediate disengagement. But Hellcats are everywhere. There is no safe direction to escape. Adaptation collapses under scale. Zeros that avoid climbing are cut down by diving attacks. Those that attempt defensive turns bleed speed and are destroyed seconds later. Escorts are stripped away long before bombers reach their targets. Japanese pilots do everything they have been taught, and it still isn't enough. For the Americans, the battle feels almost unreal. Hellcat pilots report kills faster than they can be recorded. Radio calls remain calm, procedural, targets spotted, targets destroyed, fuel checks, altitude calls. By midday, the sky is empty. What remains of Japanese air power is scattered wreckage drifting across the Philippine Sea. This battle will later be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for Japanese pilots who survived, there is nothing casual about it. It is the final confirmation that tactical adaptation cannot overcome structural inferiority. They changed how they fought. The enemy changed the war. After June 1944, Japanese air tactics continue to evolve, but now in desperation. Missions emphasize interception over combat, survival over victory. Eventually, even those priorities collapse into last resort measures. The Hellcat does not just defeat Japanese pilots in the air, it renders their adaptations irrelevant. By allowing American pilots to survive mistakes and return smarter, bolder, and more numerous, the Hellcat ensures that every tactical lesson Japan learns arrives too late to matter. The change happened overnight. The consequences lasted forever. It is about coping with its existence. By late 1944, the skies over the Pacific belonged to the Americans. Hellcats patrol almost unchallenged above invasion fleets, airfields, and shipping lanes. Japanese aircraft still rise to meet them, but no longer with expectations of victory. Tactical manuals continue to change. Pilots are instructed to avoid Hellcats entirely unless conditions are perfect. Interceptions are to be brief. Engagements are to be broken off at the first sign of danger. Survival is emphasized not as a means to fight another day, but simply to preserve dwindling manpower. This represents a complete inversion of pre-war Japanese air doctrine. Once, aggression was everything. Now, restraint is mandatory. But restraint cannot protect fragile aircraft in hostile skies. Zeros attempting interception runs are detected early by radar. Hellcats are already waiting above them. Even when Japanese pilots manage surprise, the result is often the same hits that do not kill, followed by swift retaliation. And so tactics continue to narrow. Japanese pilots begin avoiding combat altogether when possible. They fly lower, use terrain, operate at dusk or dawn, anything to reduce exposure to Hellcats. These measures buy minutes, sometimes seconds, never control. The psychological toll is severe. Pilots take off knowing that even perfect execution may end in failure. They know the Hellcat's strengths intimately now, not from intelligence briefings, but from hard experience. They know which maneuvers are forbidden, which instincts must be suppressed. Flying becomes an exercise in constraint. American pilots sense this immediately. Hellcat squadrons encounter less resistance, fewer aggressive challenges. Japanese fighters disengage quickly or avoid contact entirely. The enemy is still skilled but trapped by the limitations of his aircraft and his shrinking options. By this stage of the war, American losses are increasingly due to accidents and mechanical failures, not enemy action. The Hellcat has done what no tactical innovation alone ever could. It has made adaptation insufficient. Japanese commanders understand the implications. No amount of pilot courage or tactical ingenuity can reverse a structural disadvantage of this scale. The war in the air has crossed a threshold where effort no longer translates into results. This realization sets the stage for a tragic shift. When conventional tactics no longer work, extreme measures begin to seem rational. And soon, Japanese air strategy will change one final time, not toward adaptation, but toward sacrifice. They are being asked to accept the impossible. The Hellcat still patrols overhead, scarred, battle-worn, but dominant. American carriers operate with near impunity. Radar detects every approach. Combat air patrols intercept long before Japanese aircraft can threaten the fleet. There is no tactic left to change. The Zero is obsolete. Pilot shortages are critical. Fuel is scarce. Training is minimal. Japanese commanders understand this with painful clarity. Conventional air combat against Hellcats is no longer viable. Adaptation has reached its limit. And so doctrine shifts one final time. Not toward victory, but toward impact. Pilots are told their aircraft no longer need to survive. They only need to reach the target. Maneuverability, climb performance, disengagement, all the principles that once defined Japanese air combat are discarded. The Hellcat did not just force tactical change, it forced philosophical collapse. For American pilots, this creates a new kind of mission. Intercepts are now races against time. Hellcats dive on incoming aircraft before they can descend. Fire is concentrated, relentless. There's no dogfight, only destruction. Japanese pilots fly straight and low, often alone, knowing exactly what awaits them. Some are veterans who remember when the Zero ruled the sky. Others are barely trained, gripping controls with white knuckles, following orders they never imagined would be given. In the air, the Hellcat still performs the same role it always has. It climbs faster. It dives harder. It survives damage. But now it is not fighting tactics. It is fighting desperation. For Japanese pilots who survive these missions, few as they are, the realization is absolute. The war in the air was lost long before this point. It was lost the moment adaptation became insufficient. The moment American aircraft could survive mistakes, learn faster, and return in greater numbers. The Hellcat represents that moment more clearly than any statistic. It did not win by brilliance. It won by endurance. And when endurance became one-sided, tactics no longer mattered. The overnight changes Japanese pilots made after meeting the Hellcat were real, intelligent, and necessary. They were also too late, because the Hellcat did not demand better tactics from its pilots. It demanded survival, and that changed everything.